Have you ever wondered why some plants that grow all over a garden are treated like weeds today, even though plants like these once helped feed people for generations? Have you ever considered that the agricultural history of North America most people carry in their minds might be only a small fragment of a much larger story? Before corn became the crop most commonly linked with this land, what was already growing here? If an agricultural system worked well for a very long time, why have most people never heard the names of the plants that made it possible? And if that story is true, could one of those forgotten crops still be growing in plain sight, right now, perhaps at the edge of a yard, or in the corner of a garden, dismissed without a second thought? Imagine standing still in the late warmth of a summer evening. The sunlight is fading into gold. The ground is still holding the heat of the day. Insects move through the air with a steady hum. Along the edge of a garden where few people bother to look closely, tall stems rise quietly into the last light. Some plants grow in disturbed soil where the ground has recently been turned. Others appear among carefully tended beds. Some would be pulled out immediately by a modern gardener who sees them as unwanted. It is such a familiar image that it barely seems worth noticing. Yet from that ordinary scene, a different door into history begins to open. Perhaps what we are looking at is not merely untidy growth. Perhaps some of these plants are living traces of an ancient food system that once mattered deeply. Thousands of years ago in the Wabash River Valley, in what is now Illinois, indigenous farming communities were maintaining organized garden plots. What makes this history so powerful is that they were not relying entirely on corn in the way modern audiences often assume. They were growing native plants that fit the land around them. They watched these crops over many seasons. They saved better seeds. They gradually shaped them through human care and repeated selection. Seeds became larger. Seed coats became thinner. Usefulness improved over time. This is not the image of people gathering random food from the wild whenever they happen to find it. This is knowledge built slowly. This is patience. This is agriculture with intention, with memory, and with skill passed through generations. What gives this story its real force is not only that such crops existed, but that they raise a deeper question. If this agricultural system worked, if it lasted, and if it fed people well enough to remain part of daily life, why did it almost disappear from public memory? The answer is more thoughtful than dramatic. These crops did not simply vanish because they were worthless. Modern experimental research suggests that several of them were productive and nutritionally impressive. What faded was not only the crops themselves, but their place in exchange networks and in the historical story that later generations came to repeat. As corn became easier to trade and easier to spread through wider systems, many native crops that had once held central roles in local food traditions gradually moved outward from the center and then slipped from common memory. That is why what stands before us now is more than a list of 8 unusual plants. This is a nearly sleeping chapter in the agricultural history of North America. It is a chapter that reminds us that plants dismissed as weeds today may once have been food. Plants treated as ordinary may once have been the result of generations of careful selection. Plants growing quietly at the edge of modern life may still carry the memory of a deep indigenous knowledge shaped in relationship with local land. When we begin to look again at that long partnership between people and plants, the landscape changes. Things that seemed small begin to feel important. Things that seemed forgotten begin to speak again. And the ground beneath a simple garden starts to look like a place where history never fully disappeared at all. As the wider picture of indigenous agriculture starts to come into focus, the most surprising part is not found in large fields or dramatic tools. It is found in the plants that are easiest to dismiss. Some of them appear at the edge of a garden, along a fence line, or in freshly disturbed soil, and the first modern impulse is often to pull them out. Yet for a very long time, several plants in that category once held an important place in the daily lives of indigenous communities across eastern North America. The story becomes clearer when we look closely at the first three names. They are not merely botanical details. They are evidence that the history of food on this continent was once far richer than most people have been taught to imagine. The first is goosefoot, also widely known as lamb's quarters. This is a plant that many gardeners still encounter every summer. It readily appears where soil has been disturbed and is often seen as an intruder among more carefully chosen crops. But if we step back thousands of years, the image changes completely. Goosefoot was once one of the plants intentionally tended and selected in eastern North America. That matters because it shows that early farmers were not only relying on large and obvious crops. They also recognized the value of smaller, resilient native plants that were already well suited to the land around them. Goosefoot seeds are rich in protein, its leaves can be eaten as greens, and its close relationship to quinoa makes its value easier for a modern audience to understand. What makes this plant so striking is the contrast between then and now. A plant many people remove from their gardens today may once have been part of a carefully maintained food tradition. If goosefoot feels surprising, sumpweed pushes that feeling even further. Sumpweed, also known as marsh elder, is now regarded in some places as an unwanted agricultural plant. Yet in the past, it was a valuable food source. Its seeds were rich in both fat and protein, which means they offered dense energy in a form any farming society would have understood as important. Looking at sumpweed forces us to question the labels of the present. The way a plant is classified today does not always reflect its historical worth. Something seen as a nuisance in one century may have been observed, cultivated, and relied upon in another. That reversal is one of the most powerful ideas in this story because it changes how the audience sees the ground beneath familiar landscapes. The third name is little barley. Compared with the first two, little barley expands the viewer's understanding of what a food crop can be. Not every grain has to resemble wheat or corn in order to matter. Little barley is a native grass that completes its life cycle relatively early, helping fill an important seasonal gap before many other crops reach maturity. Its significance lies not only in the seed itself, but in timing. A durable agricultural system does not depend only on variety. It also depends on rhythm across the year. In that sense, little barley becomes an especially meaningful detail. It suggests that early farmers were not simply gathering edible plants wherever they happened to find them. They were combining different species in ways that could support a steadier and more thoughtful food supply over time. When goosefoot, sumpweed, and little barley are placed side by side, something important begins to emerge. These are not isolated examples. They are three pieces of a larger pattern, showing that indigenous communities in eastern North America developed a deep and sustained relationship with native plants. They were not standing apart from the land and using it temporarily. They were observing, selecting, encouraging, and living closely enough with these species to make them part of an organized way of life. The result is that the forgotten agricultural system introduced earlier now starts to feel more real, more textured, and more human. And as that picture sharpens, curiosity deepens because the plants that come next reveal an even more refined level of knowledge built into this older food world. As the first three plants begin to unsettle the listener's familiar ideas about weeds and food crops, the wider pattern also starts to come into sharper focus. What matters at this stage is not simply that earlier communities knew which plants were edible. What matters even more is that they seem to have understood how to arrange plants across seasons, functions, and everyday needs. A real agricultural system is not made only from a few edible species. It needs rhythm. It needs continuity. It needs a way to bridge the empty spaces in a year when people still have to live store food and depend on the land around them. This is where maygrass and erect knotweed become especially important, because they reveal that this native crop system was neither crude nor accidental. It had structure, it had timing, it had intelligence built into it. Maygrass is one of those plants that quietly changes the way a modern audience thinks. It is a native spring annual maturing early and producing seed at a point in the year when many other crops have not yet reached harvest. That detail alone suggests a very thoughtful agricultural logic. Earlier, farmers were not only asking which plants could be eaten, they were asking when food would become available over the course of the year. A plant that matures early can help bridge a lean season. It can soften the pressure of waiting for later crops. It can create continuity in the food calendar. Archaeological evidence placing maygrass in storage pits and domestic settings suggests that it was not casually gathered and immediately consumed whenever someone happened to encounter it. It was grown, harvested, kept, and woven into daily life as a dependable resource. The repeated appearance of maygrass in those contexts points to something important. Indigenous communities were not living at the mercy of chance. They were shaping the rhythm of subsistence with care and foresight. If maygrass reveals an awareness of timing erect, knotweed reveals something else: the power of selection and the persistence of management. Today, the word knotweed often carries negative associations. Many people think immediately of aggressive, invasive species that spread relentlessly and create problems. But the plant in this story is a native annual with a very different place in the older landscape. What makes it especially compelling is that modern research and cultivation experiments have helped recover part of its identity as a meaningful food crop. Erect knotweed seeds may not create the same instant image in the mind as corn or wheat, yet that is exactly what makes this plant so revealing. It shows that in a food system shaped by local knowledge, even small and visually modest species could hold major value. When grown alongside plants such as goosefoot, it has even shown notable productive potential. That changes the way we understand these ancient crops. They are not simply archaeological specimens resting in reports and museum drawers. They once operated in a living system on real ground, within real communities. When maygrass and erect knotweed are placed beside goosefoot sumpweed and little barley, a larger truth begins to emerge. Indigenous communities in eastern North America did not just stumble across a few useful plants. They built a network of crops that complemented one another. Some matured early. Some contributed protein. Some offered fat-rich seeds. Some thrived in disturbed soil. Some became more valuable when grown in relation to other species. Those are the marks of an agricultural system with memory structure and long observation behind it. At this point, the idea of a forgotten chapter in history no longer feels abstract. It begins to take on a more definite shape, as if layer by layer the ground is being gently cleared, and the deeper logic of an older food world is coming back into view. As the picture of this native crop system becomes clearer, something especially fascinating begins to emerge. Not every plant in this story is completely unfamiliar. Some of them are still seen today, still planted, and even still admired. Yet most people do not realize that the familiar image they know is only the final layer of a much longer history. This is where the sense of discovery deepens. Sometimes the most surprising part of a story is not a plant no one has ever heard of, but a plant that feels almost too familiar to question. In that way, sunflower and squash become especially powerful examples because they show how the visible present can hide a much older agricultural memory. Sunflower is the first plant that creates that feeling of recognition. Most people know sunflower as a tall and striking flower, often associated with gardens, decorative fields, or modern food products. But the sunflower familiar to modern audiences is largely the result of a long period of commercial selection shaped by specific goals, such as uniform harvesting, large flower heads, and optimized oil production. The older native sunflower tended by indigenous communities in eastern North America expressed itself differently. It could branch more freely, produce many smaller heads, and be harvested over a longer stretch of time, rather than in a single concentrated moment. That difference is not only visual, it reflects a different agricultural rhythm, one tied to everyday life, and to the gradual gathering of useful seeds. Those seeds provided both oil and protein, making sunflower far more than an ornamental presence. When viewed this way, sunflower becomes a reminder that beauty and utility were never separate categories in older food systems. A plant modern people often treat as decorative once stood much closer to the center of nourishment. That same shift in perspective continues with squash. Today, the word squash often brings to mind familiar market varieties associated with autumn meals, seasonal recipes, and home cooking. But the native squash cultivated in North America before European contact did not fully match the image many viewers may carry in their minds. In earlier forms, squash was valuable not only for its flesh. Its seeds were especially important because they concentrated much of the plant's energy and nutritional value. The fruit itself could also serve practical purposes beyond eating, functioning as a lightweight container, useful in settled daily life. That detail alone changes the emotional texture of the plant. Something now seen mainly as a seasonal food was once part of a broader material world. It helped feed people, but it also supported the ordinary mechanics of living. Seen in that light, squash becomes more than a crop. It becomes part of an entire way of life shaped by usefulness, continuity, and adaptation. When sunflower and squash are placed beside goosefoot sumpweed, little barley maygrass, and erect knotweed, a larger truth comes into focus again. This native agricultural system was rich, not only because it included many plants, but because each one served a different role. Some offered oil-rich seeds. Some contributed protein. Some helped bridge seasonal gaps. Some supported both nourishment and practical daily needs. That is what makes the story feel so alive. Earlier communities were not merely planting crops. They were building a plant world capable of supporting life in multiple ways at once. As those layers of meaning continue to unfold, the audience can begin to see that some native food sources never fully disappeared. They changed form. They shifted position. They remained in the modern world under a surface most people no longer connect to their deeper origin. And it is precisely that quiet survival that makes the next part of the story feel so immediate and so close to the present. As the layers of history continue to unfold through each plant, the distance of the past begins to move closer to the present. By now, the story no longer lives only in archaeological storage pits, buried seed remains, or academic studies about food systems that slipped out of common memory. It begins to press against a far more immediate question. Among all the plants that once helped feed people on this land, is there one that still remains visible, enough, resilient enough, and useful enough to make a modern audience rethink what native food can mean? The answer arrives through a name that sounds both familiar and strange at the same time. Jerusalem artichoke, also known as sunchoke, stands out because it does more than reconnect a lost history. It reveals that a meaningful native food source is still very close to present life. One reason Jerusalem artichoke is so memorable is that its name itself creates confusion. It is not an artichoke in the way many people assume, and it is not truly connected to Jerusalem in the ordinary geographic sense. Yet behind that misleading name is a native North American plant with edible tubers that indigenous communities cultivated and exchanged long before modern food culture gave it intermittent attention. The plant belongs to the sunflower family, but instead of concentrating value in seeds, it stores much of its importance underground. That is where the story suddenly feels especially relevant to modern life. Jerusalem artichoke is perennial. It returns year after year. It tolerates imperfect soil relatively well. Once established, it can continue with surprisingly little care. Those qualities alone make it a powerful image within this larger story. At a time when many modern food systems depend on long supply chains, high inputs, and increasingly complex structures of production, here is a native plant, quietly demonstrating a different form of endurance, one that feels calmer, more grounded, and more closely tied to the land itself. Its significance becomes even stronger when nutrition enters the picture. Jerusalem artichoke tubers are rich in inulin, a prebiotic fiber closely linked to gut health and the modern language of functional nutrition. For contemporary listeners, that idea feels current and familiar. People hear about digestion microbiomes and beneficial fiber in health conversations all the time. What makes this plant so compelling is that it does not belong to a recent wellness trend. It belongs to a much older native food landscape. When that fact is placed beside the stories of goosefoot sumpweed, little barley maygrass erect, knotweed sunflower, and squash, the boundary between past and present begins to soften. Things once pushed into the background of history did not always disappear. Sometimes they simply stopped occupying the center of public attention. Seen from this point, the importance of the 8 crops is no longer just the surprise attached to each individual name. Their greater value lies in the pattern they create together. Some are now classified as weeds in certain places. Some are rich in protein. Some offered fat-dense seeds. Some matured early enough to bridge seasonal gaps. Some survive today, but in forms that no longer resemble the earlier expressions people once relied on. And one like Jerusalem artichoke remains strong enough to remind us that native food does not belong only to the distant past. It can still be part of the present if people are willing to look again. Once that realization settles in, the audience is no longer only learning about a list of unusual plants. A deeper question begins to rise. Perhaps what has been forgotten is not merely the names of certain crops. Perhaps what has faded is an entire way of living with local land, understanding its patterns, and trusting the long, nourishing potential of what already belongs to the place beneath our feet. As this journey reaches its final stretch, what remains is not only the names of 8 plants or a handful of facts about yield, nutrition, and cultivation. What remains is something deeper, a different way of seeing land memory, and the long relationship between people and the plants that rise from the places where they live. If we return now to the image of a late summer evening, to the warm ground holding the last light of day, to the stems standing quietly at the edge of a garden, and to the steady hum of insects in the air, the feeling is no longer the same as it was at the beginning. What may once have looked like a weed, a stray plant, or something easy to ignore, now carries a different meaning. It suggests that beneath the familiar surface of the present history never truly disappeared. It simply grew quieter, settled deeper, and waited to be seen again by someone willing to look more slowly and more carefully. The most important part of this story is not to reject the crops people depend on today, and it is not to romanticize the past as though it were simple or perfect. Its real value lies in recognizing that the agricultural history of North America was far richer than the narrow version many people still carry in their minds. There was once a native crop system shaped through long observation, patient experimentation, and a deep relationship with local conditions. Within that system were plants rich in protein, plants rich in oil, plants that matured early enough to bridge seasonal gaps, and plants that supported not only diet, but also the practical texture of daily life. Each species held a different role, yet together they reveal an agricultural intelligence with structured depth and a remarkable ability to adapt to the land itself. When we look at goosefoot, sumpweed, little barley, maygrass erect, knotweed, sunflower squash, and Jerusalem artichoke, we are not only looking at plants, we are looking at living memory from a culture of cultivation. This is the memory of communities that learned the land through repetition across generations, that understood which plants returned in disturbed soil, which ones could soften a difficult part of the food year, which could provide dense nourishment, and which could be saved, selected, and improved over time. In that sense, indigenous knowledge does not appear as a static relic from the past. It appears as a living system of understanding that was once practical, necessary, and deeply connected to caring for land, rather than merely extracting from it for a moment. That may be where the human meaning of the story becomes clearest. When a society forgets the plants that once fed people on the very ground beneath their feet, what disappears is not only a set of names or uses. What fades is also part of a way of living in closer conversation with local environments. And when that memory begins to return, even through a small act of curiosity, another door opens with it. It is a door toward humility, toward history, and toward the knowledge of people who lived long before us. Perhaps the next time someone sees a plant rising quietly at the edge of a garden, they will pause a little longer before calling it a weed. Perhaps that small pause will be enough to awaken a new question. And sometimes a question as small as that becomes the place where a much larger shift begins in how we see land, how we think about food, and how we understand the long story human beings have written together with plants over thousands of years.